So you are an award-winning author, and that is not saying enough because it's been a number of things that you've won awards for, including Ring Shout, your novellas Ring Shout, The Black God's Drums, and The Haunting of Tramcar 015. You're publishing all over the place in a lot of the science fiction and fantasy magazines that we're also looking at: Tor, Daily Science Fiction, Lightspeed, Fireside, among others. And you're a founding member of, is it FIA? Is that how to say it?
No, it's FIA. FIA.
FIA, as in FIA, literary magazine. You're born in New York, you were raised mostly in Texas, but you also spent some of your early years in your parents' homes of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
And you are also a historian.
Yeah.
So you're pretty busy.
Like yourself in that sense.
Yeah. But I would first like to ask you if it's all right to read some of the story, if you have it in front of you.
Sure. I actually do. Thank you, everyone. I have it. It's always hard to find because it's a digital story, but luckily it made one of these best of anthologies, which allows me to have it in print. So I can actually read some to you. So I will read a bit of this story, The Secret Lives of the 9 Negro Teeth of George Washington, from Fireside Fiction. And what I'll do is I'll just read one of the small vignettes, and I'll read the second one, which was one of my favorites because it really jumped people into the story. The second Negro tooth belonging to George Washington came from a slave from the kingdom of Ebony, what the English with their inarticulate tongues called Bonnie Land, and, much to his annoyance, hence him, a Bonnie man. The Bonnie man journeyed from Africa on a ship called the Jesus, which, as he understood, was named for an ancient sorcerer who defied death. Unlike the other slaves bound on that ship, who came from the hinterlands beyond his kingdom, he knew the fate that awaited him, though he would never know what law or sacred edict he had broken that sent him to this fate. He found himself in that fetid hull, chained beside a merman, with scales that sparkled like green jewels and eyes as round as black coins. The Bonnie man had seen mermen before out among the waves, and stories said some of them swam into rivers to find wives among local fisherwomen. But he hadn't known the whites made slaves of them too. As he would later learn, mermen were prized by thaumaturgic inclined aristocrats who dressed them in fine livery to display to guests. Most, however, were destined for Spanish holdings, where they were forced to dive for giant pearls off the shores of New Granada. The two survived the horrors of the passage by relying on each other. The Bonnie man shared tales of his kingdom, of his wife and children and family forever lost. The merman, in turn, told of his underwater home, of its queen and many curiosities. He also taught the Bonnie man a song, a plea to old and terrible things that dwelled in the deep, dark, hidden parts of the sea. Great beings with gaping mouths that opened up whirlpools or tentacles that could drag ships beneath the depths. They would one day rise to wreak havoc, to wreak vengeance, he promised, for all those who had been chained to suffer in these floating coffins. The Bonnie man never saw the merman after they made land on the English Isle of Barbados, but he carried the song with him as far as the colony of Virginia, and on the Mount Vernon plantation, he sang it as he looked across fields of wheat to an ocean he couldn't see and waited. When George Washington wore the Bonnie man's tooth, he found himself humming an unknown song that sounded, strange to his thinking, like the tongue of the savage merman, and in the dark, hidden parts of the sea, old and terrible things stirred. And that's where I'll stop the reading. So we can.
Thank you.
Class, no problem.
Could you tell us a little bit? I'm going to start with a couple of questions and then have the students jump in. But could you start by telling us a little bit of how you came to this story and why you wanted to put it in the form of a story?
Yeah. So, you know, as often when it comes to, I suppose, the impetus, what drives you, you sometimes never know exactly what it is. And it's often sometimes looking back, you're trying to remember, where did that idea come from? And so I think it was several places. I think one, it was uh, actually visiting the African American Museum during its opening, the one in Washington, D.C. I was able to visit it on this premiere opening, and they had an exhibit there that had been at several other places in the Smithsonian, actually. And it was an exhibit of Thomas Jefferson and Monticello. And what they'd done was they had a statue of Thomas Jefferson, and they had these bricks. And each brick, I think there was something like 209, represented one of the enslaved people in Monticello. And so it was this interesting juxtaposition of Thomas Jefferson as, American founder and statesman and well-known figure, and yet these other figures that were unknown, these enslaved people who were represented at times by smaller statues about him that were kind of in the background in the shadows, but most of them represented by these bricks that would simply, say like, Antonio Moore, age so-and-so, and have some small description, because that's the description probably that one can find in a ledger when you look at Thomas Jefferson's holdings. And so things like that, and there are other things I can probably think of, made me often think of how the voices of enslaved people are often lost. When we think about even slave narratives that we have, they represent a fraction, like a minuscule of all enslaved people, right? A slave narrative is a rare document in many ways, because most enslaved people were not recording their stories for posterity, and they were not getting to record their stories themselves. And so most of those voices are unknown. Most of those voices are lost or silenced. And we sometimes, as historians, we have to try to recreate those voices based on the voices of others, based on our understanding of the context of the history of the time. And so we're often doing a lot of, in many ways, guesswork. We're doing a lot of our own form of speculation, right? And there is sometimes some pushback against that in the academy, because it's thought, well, you didn't actually go into the archives and find this, so how can you say so-and-so did this, right? We don't have their voices, and therefore maybe it's a bit wrong to actually speculate. And I think persons like myself, we push back against that, push back against the pushback, and we basically say, look, we understand that their voices were unheard, and we're trying to recreate it. But if we simply stop at the idea that we can't get at them, then it's a second silencing, right? Where we're allowing the history to silence them again. And so I've often been drawn to that notion of trying to get at these voices, trying to understand what their lives may be, even if we have to construct it bit by bit. And so I think that was one of the influences. Then by chance, I was doing some research and I came across the notion of George Washington's teeth, which I think anyone who's grown up in the United States at any point, you've probably heard they were made out of what? Everybody's probably heard they were made out of wood, right? We have entire national narratives and mythologies. And when I was actually looking at an article by one of the archivists who runs the George Washington papers, who had come across, well, first of all, they knew they were not made out of wood. They were made out of various different items, bone, different ivory, different things, and also some human teeth, which was not uncommon at the time. But what, interestingly, this archive has found, just to show you how random history is, just literally in a ledger by George Washington's cousin, who's taking care of one of his other estates. In between, it's basically a book ledger, in between payment for a broken window and payment for a ream of this type of cloth that came from China, is a simple, small notation. It says, paid to this doctor so-and-so shillings for 9 Negro teeth. That's it, right? And so that is the entirety of what we know. And so when we talk about the archives having these silences, the archives having their own biases, right? We have, what else can we say about those 9 Negro teeth? Who were those people who gave up those teeth? Why did they give them up? What's the story behind their lives? Did George Washington ever wear these teeth? We have no idea. All we have is that one little line. And so when I saw that, it just got me to thinking again, these thoughts that I've often had on how do you get it silence people? How frustrating it is to not have anything about those folks' lives. And even as a historian, I can only speculate so much, right? Even the archivist, she said, I found this, and we can only speculate so much. We have no idea who these belong to. But turns out I also do this other thing where I write speculative fiction, actual speculative fiction with fantasy and magic and so forth. And so I saw a way here outside of the academy to try to get at the lives of these 9 people. And of course, it's not based on the actual lives of all of George Washington's enslaved people. I pulled on various aspects of Atlantic history and Atlantic slavery, various narratives and different things. And I decided I can imbue it with a bit more magic, right? If I'm going to speculate, why not throw in some mermen and werewolves and what have you, as a way to draw in readers who may not come to this story naturally, but once the merman hits them, they're there for the rest of the story. So that's my long-winded spiel on how that came about.
Oh, that's great. Next on Friday, we're going, we can't go, but we're looking at the Locus Archives, which is an archive here at Duke. So I want to just underscore that the archives have a bias. That comment is really important because of what an archive might hold and how you interpret that. I want to just take you back a little bit to talk about how you came to love speculative fiction, because I've read a couple of interviews with you where you talk about sort of your early reading and the kinds of things that sort of inspired you. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I always say it has to come from all sorts of things. Some of my early years growing up with my grandparents in Trinidad, where folklore is common, right? And so a lot of it came through oral folklore in the beginning, through the few television shows that we had on between BBC and Hindi television that we would see. And then coming to the United States, I have to credit my own innate curiosity. It was literally, I suppose it was jump-started by my parents. My mother loved old shows like Twilight Zone and so forth, and she'd sit down with me and we'd watch those. My father was the big Godzilla movie fan and those early Boris Karloff type movies. So we would sit down, read and watch those for very long periods of time. And my mother also took my sister and I to the library almost like 2-3 times a week. And so I constantly got to feed that interest in speculative fiction. And I read all I suppose back then, now we go, by the way, you go into like the young adults or the middle grade books. There's more books than ever existed when I was a kid. But I think one of the first books series I read, fantasy series I read The Hobbit, because I saw a cartoon on TV with it and I wanted it. And then I read, I think C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. Like some of the things I read were like Ursula Le Guin's works with Earthsea. And so I was just automatically thrown into this world of all of this interesting literature. And, it was one of those things people would say, oh, you'll grow out of it one day. I didn't grow out of it. Turns out I grew into it. I kept on reading it.
You, in one of your interviews, you talk about Pauline Hopkins, the quote about that fiction can play a role in illuminating some of the best truths of a fractured past.
Yeah.
And I want to know, and this kind of builds on the question about why magic and speculative fiction was a choice that you made for the George Washington's teeth story. But I wonder if you could comment specifically on the idea of justice in your fictional work. How do you see that? How do you approach that as a writer?
Right. Great question. And just have to bring up Pauline Hopkins because here is this Black woman writing. She's well known. First off, it is just her early writing. She's writing novels and what have you. She's a newspaper editor. She's also writing, she's actually trying to look at Black history. This is perfect for Black History Month. And she's doing all of this like in 1900, right? at a point where no one is doing this, right? Certainly in a larger society. This is an era where anti-Black racism is rampant. And here she is, purposely like running newspapers whose job often is not just to inform the Black community, but to serve as these vehicles of politics, right? These vehicles of giving African Americans this voice. And when she does history, it's not simply to know, like her history has a strong social political agenda, right? It's to fight back against anti-Black racism, right? So she wants to uncover ancient history of Black people and their role within the world to combat notions that Black people are inferior or what have you, the scientific racism of the time, which again was quite rampant in the United States and globally. And so one of the things she also does is she dabbles in speculative fiction. And she writes one of these earliest works by a Black author in speculative fiction called Of One Blood in 1900s. Basically, it's a series about a young Black medical student who is not in tune with himself or self-aware, and he ends up going on this trip to East Africa, where he comes upon an ancient African city that's been around for thousands of years, where the people there use telekinesis and they use crystals and suspended animation and all of these type of things that we think of normally as sci-fi tropes, right? And the entire story, I mean, it gets didactic, but it's certainly the entire point here is to teach this lesson to this young Black man and finding some kind of sense of pride in himself and combating the racism that he has been pummeled with by finding this long lost, ancestral home or what have you, these people with these technologies that defy the modern age. And so, yeah, when she wrote it, she spoke of the fact that she did history, she did literature as well, but she sometimes saw the use of such things, as she didn't call it speculative fiction at the time, this more fantastic history, as a great way to tell greater truths, right? That you can wrap them up in forms of metaphor and so forth. And I think I've taken that to heart in a lot of the work I do, but I've also taken to heart her notion that your stories can serve purposes, right? It can serve a purpose. And, that isn't to say that every story I write has some large, deeper meaning that you can go in. Like I've told someone before, I said, not to sound cliche, but sometimes simply having a character who's a person of color, having a queer character, what have you, in the space, is sometimes its own form of justice and revolutionary action, because those kinds of things were not there, right? And so I suppose when I write, I'm often aware of those things, about the characters I create, the worlds they inhabit, and if I can provide some larger lesson, or I'll take that back, if I can provide some food for thought so that people can walk away knowing a bit more and having interesting conversations, because I'm less interested actually in telling you, this is what I want you to think. I'd like to see how people approach it and what they bring out of it. If I can do that while I'm also having fun doing speculative fiction, then great.
And kind of following on that, you, as I mentioned earlier, you were a founding member of FIA. Why is that important to have a vehicle that promotes Black writers and a Black point of view?
Right. And so what's interesting is the idea for this magazine came about because, first of all, it's based on Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes' original publication, Fire, which was this Harlem Renaissance publication by these Black writers who decided to come together, and they wanted to do something what they considered what all the young writers were doing. And it was a way to both critique the larger white literary spaces that ignored them, but also be more what they considered the more conservative Black literary spaces weren't ready for the type of work they were doing, right? So like a lot of Du Bois wanted work that elevated the race, right? And spoke positively. They were like, no, we want to write a story about a Black prostitute. We want to write about the Black underclass. We want to use slang and curse and talk about things in here that would offend those who are looking for quote unquote positive images, right? And so I wanted to create something like that in Black speculative fiction to highlight younger writers who I saw doing some phenomenal work, And so that was the purpose. I, of course, at the time, I was finishing my dissertation. I had no time to do any of it. So what's great is that some of those young writers took that idea and kind of ran with it. And though I'm a founding member, I'm like in the back. I'm like a disembodied voice in the back. They did everything. They actually put it together. And their impetus for actually doing it was an article, I believe, that came out, I want to say in 2015 or 16. And it was from Fireside Fiction. And it was a study in which they found that within the very valuable science fiction short story market, Black writers made up, like, I want to say, I mean, I don't have exact numbers here, but literally less than 5% of published writers. And it had been going on for a while. And it was just dismal, and it shook up in many ways the sci-fi markets, where they started saying, well, why is this? Like, why can't we find Black writers? And so while there was also that push to try to make those markets become more diverse, there was also discussion among people who would found Fire that, okay, but we also need a space in the meantime. We can't wait for them to get on board. There are Black writers who want to be published now. And so they created Fire, which has gone on to be phenomenal. The Fire has won awards, won World Fantasy Award. It has put out some top writers who've gone on, some of them going on now to write novels. It has put on its own con recently, which is in this virtual world, which outdid some of the conferences, the cons that were much larger than were putting this on. They put this on themselves, and it's been amazing. So it's been a great venture. And I think what's so important about it, there's almost this cynical retort to the largest sci-fi magazines who would say, well, we couldn't find Black writers. And Fire would say, well, we found them. But do we have some magic ability that the rest of you don't? Because here they all are. Here we get so many, we have to turn down a ton. So obviously the Black writers are there. And so it's kind of pushing these other markets to say, why aren't you finding them? Where are the spaces you are not inhabiting? And are your spaces not as welcoming? And what can you do to fix that? So I think it's been important for its own right and what it does, but as well as pushing the larger market to think about diversity in more than just a few panels that they have once in a while, but in actual ways to structurally change things.
Great, and kind of, and again, a sort of a bridge question. Congratulations, because Ring Shout has been optioned for television.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask what you thought about this. I would love to know what you call it, but this emergence of speculative fiction in television. You know, with Jordan Peele's kind of imagining of Lovecraft, and then name escaping me, begins with Tulsa.
Oh, the Watchmen series.
Watchmen, yeah, Watchmen, you know, really very actively taking on some of these issues. Black Panther, obviously. What do you think about that? What would you call it, and what do you think about the effect of that?
I don't have a word for it yet. Like I always tell people, it's two things, right? For one, I always joke and I say that I'm old enough that I came up when if there were two science fiction shows on TV, you were happy. And maybe one of them was good, right? And maybe 10 years later, you would say that didn't hold up well, right? Now we live in an era where there's so much TV and so much of it is speculative fiction, right? Like you don't have to worry about the major networks anymore. You now have streaming services from Netflix, Hulu, you got Amazon, and it's just amazing how much of them have devoted their time to speculative fiction, which was seen as this backwater type of thing. You threw people a Star Trek series or something of the sort, but it wasn't actual, riveting television. Now it's become the center of it. HBO is paying, millions for an episode to tell us George Martin's unfinished story. That was my little dig there. Game of Thrones, right?
That's a separate class. Yeah.
We could talk about the last episode. That's a whole semester. And so, yeah, so that's happening. When I think about superhero movies, it's always a joke when we talk about, like I said, I remember early superhero movies. They looked horrible, right? Now you have studios that are spending tons, hundreds of millions of dollars to give us CGI, well done superhero movies. Television shows are doing it. You know, I think of Legion and all those things on FX. And so we are living in an interesting era where science fiction like won. I said, yeah, the geek stuff won. Who knew, right, that it would? It's now like one of the dominant, these dominant genres. It's everywhere. So even if people don't read it, they watch it, they imbibe it in some way. And so what's happened now is, well, I think, and what you're speaking of, is we're now seeing also this Black speculative renaissance going on within the television and movie industry, which is, all I can say is, wow, how long will it last? I don't know. But I'm enjoying it while it does, right? I think people like Jordan Peele have really, I mean, from the beginning with Get Out and then, you know, Us, and now he's doing his own Twilight Zone, and, you know, he's helping produce things like Matt Ruff's, the adaptation of Matt Ruff's book Lovecraft Country, and he's bringing in other Black writers so they can do their own things. I do think it's an amazing time. I think even Watchmen, the desire to redo that classic graphic novel from the point of view of the Black experience, I don't know what fully pushed the show writers to do that, but great, right? And so I'm hoping to see more of it. I'm hoping it's not simply something that will cycle through and then people will be finished with it for a while. There have been these bursts of interest in Black film before, and then the Hollywood is interested in them, and then it peters out. But I'm hoping that we'll see more, and I'm actually happy for it. I want to see great Black science fiction. I want to see bad versions. I just want to see it. Period.
So I just have one last question, possibly the most important question. So get your questions ready. And that's, I think I know the answer to this, but Star Trek or Star Wars?
I don't get into those debates. I'll tell you, I mean, honestly, I like both. I'm a Star Trek. If the snob in me would say Star Trek, of course. The snob in me would say Star Trek. But I like some of the Star Wars, and I sure like some of the new stuff they're doing. Mandalorian, the remake of the Solo. I just like some of this new stuff. Rogue One. So I like the best of both worlds, and that is a Star Trek episode. There you go.
Yes, that's right. So you're very diplomatic.
Yep.
Very diplomatic. I would have said neither one The Expanse. So that's me. So questions. Please hop in. Do you have a question? I saw you were moving. Is that Piper? Yeah. Just so he can hear you.
Yeah, I was reading an interview about Ring Shout, and I haven't had the chance to actually read the book yet, but it's about you like choosing to describe like the clan members sort of as monsters. So I was just kind of wondering like why you chose that approach, like maybe to use the supernatural, like to make sense of really terrible things, or just maybe if you could talk about that a little more.
Sure. Thank you for that question. Well, I have to say, for one, it wasn't my idea. The notion of the Klan as supernatural, in a sense, came from my readings of these slave narratives that were taken by the Works Progress Administration during the 1930s as part of the New Deal, where basically people were paid to go around and record the histories and folklore and what have you of Americans, right? And one set of people they interviewed were the very elderly, basically like the last generation of Black people in the United States who had lived during slavery, and they'd been children or teenagers when freedom came. And so they lived through slavery and through Reconstruction, and they gave their stories of that time. And one of the things that they talked about, and one of the things they were interviewed and asked about, was their encounter with the first Ku Klux Klan, which was formed after the Civil War as a insurgency group with disgruntled former defeated Confederate soldiers. And they spoke of this this first Klan and how it terrorized them and the various brutalities they carried out. And they often referred to this first Klan in supernatural terms, right, to describe this terror that they were experiencing. And they pointed out that this first Klan didn't often dress like we think of the way the Klan does. That actually comes about with the second Klan, which is really what my book is focusing on. But they said this first Klan, some of them would blacken their faces, some of them wore pillowcases, some of them would wear horns on their heads or pretend they had tails, or they would pretend they could do these inhuman things like drink gallons of water, right? And so there was a way that these former slaves, and talking about that period, were talking about this terrible time that they experienced, but they imbued it with aspects of the supernatural and folklore. Like they would claim the Klan may have been haints, which is Southern term for evil, disgruntled spirits, and they would talk about ways to stop them by doing supernatural acts, like maybe they can't cross water, or you put down like vines and this would stop them. And so there was a way that they imbued the Klan with this notion of this monstrousness. And I just thought it was interesting how people who lived through this type of traumatizing racial terror, how they chose to use these fantastical imaginings of these people who were oppressing them, right? And chose to basically define them as monsters. And that's what I drew from to do what I did as well, right? And where I reimagine the Klan as monsters, though I make certain without giving it away in the story, that I differentiate between in the book between people who are Klan members who are still quite human and still quite monstrous and do terrible things, and those who go so far they become the monstrous version. Because what I didn't want to do was assign racism and hate to the realm of something that monsters do, right? I wanted to make sure that I get across that this is very human action. But I certainly pulled from those readings to come up with that idea. Just a reminder, you never know where your inspiration is going to come from.
Yeah, way up there. Just speak up so we can hear.
My question is, so I was reading a couple of things, and in the article you wrote about the short story that you just read from, you talked about how actually that the same like the story, the second tooth that you just read about, was kind of influenced by some Lovecraftian sort of literature. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking about recently, especially with speculative fiction, is the biases and stuff of the readers that we listen to, and like a lot of the our research, such as thinking about Rowling, J.K. Rowling, and kind of the recent transphobic comments that she's made, in Lovecraft and the extreme racism that he held and kind of imbued into his writing. I was wondering how do you deal with a lot of those biases in speculative fiction from the past, or how do you maybe still reckoning with it, or are still struggling with it? So I just want to hear a little bit about that, since I know you have some of the influence in your writing.
Oh, great. That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, of course, with someone like Lovecraft, who is pretty much, you read his writings, his personal works, it's pretty much as vile as you can possibly get. Lovecraft had a very long hatred list, and he was not afraid of saying it. And it's there in his work, right? His fears of the encroaching dark out to get him often has to do with the rest of the world he thought would come in and distort what he saw as his pure white New England world, right? And he writes about in his speculative work, he writes about in his personal letters. And yet, Lovecraft's influence is all over the place, right? It's there in so many things. If you watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? It's like heavily Lovecraftian themes and Angel. It's there in Marvel comics. If you read Marvel comics about world devouring characters like Galactus or all these things, right? There's a little bit of Lovecraft in all of these things. So it's hard for you to escape him. It's almost as if even if you don't want to read him and you never plan to read him, the influence is somehow there. I don't care whether you're talking about Hellboy again or various other things. And so, there's how do I deal with it? In a sense, I always say when you are a marginalized writer or reader, right? Since I was a kid, I've been dealing it with forever. So I grew up, like I said, reading Tolkien, and Tolkien could get kind of problematic after a while, right? So I would be reading Tolkien and I'd get all along with it. Then I'd have to read about, trolls that were black men from Far Harad with monstrous faces and they were half human. And so, the fact that all the Haladrim were these people from the East who were black and brown and they were all antisocial and evil and what have you. And so there was always a way that you ingested that stuff and you tried to take in what you could. You sometimes ignored the rest or you wrestled with it. And I don't think there's a marginalized person who reads speculative fiction who doesn't walk away with that kind of wrestling, right? And some people choose to walk away altogether. The late Charles Saunders, who was a black writer of fantasy, grew up reading Conan novels and Tarzan novels, right? Rice novels, pretty much contemporaries of Lovecraft and in that same vein. And he said, if I had to, he said, I grew up with it and I loved it, but as I grew older, I started to hate it. He said, and he said, I knew that if there wasn't something different out there, I was going to walk away with speculative fiction altogether and never want to read it again. And so he started writing his own. He wrote some of the first popular African fantasy novels in the 1970s and 1980s, right? And so I think it's hard to say how you deal with it because everyone's different. I think everyone has what they can stand and what they can stomach and what they're like, no. So there are a lot of things that there are popular TV shows and movies and books that I have friends who read them and they want me to get involved. And there's something in there I'm like, I'm not dealing with it. Just not going to deal with it. I don't want to. Then there are things that I do that I will read and I'll be like, I'm going to decide to look past this because I like this other thing. And they're like, absolutely not. And so I think we often have to deal with these things when we live in this world. As I often tell people, I probably have a lot of racist literary science fiction grandpas, right? I have a ton of them. And when it comes to Lovecraft, there's nothing about Lovecraft as the person I admire, but I do like tentacles. And so the way I've tended to get away with this is basically saying, I'm going to take your tentacles and I'm going to do what I want with them, which is what Lovecraft Country did, right? What writers like Victor LaValle and the Ballad of Black Tom. I'm going to take this thing that I like, but I'm going to interpret it completely differently. And that's going to be my vengeance in a sense. That's going to be how I get back at this. And so I think we're going to continue to wrestle with this. We see it, as you pointed out, with modern writers like J.K. Rowling, who has an entire generation who grew up on Harry Potter, right? Myself, who was older when it came out, I still watched a ton of it. And then she makes these horribly transphobic comments and she continues. There's no repentance. And so now everyone is left as readers, as fans of the series, even the actors themselves and actresses are left to deal with these issues and trying to figure out, can you separate the work from the person? That's not always easy, right? That's not often a thing that's easy for people to do. And I don't know if that can be done, but we're often left with these issues. But I'm sorry if I don't have a full answer, but in many ways, like I said, it has been something that I think I've navigated my entire life, and I expect to continue navigating it. And that's the best I can give, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
More questions? Yeah, go ahead, Chase. Just say your name real quick.
Oh yeah, I'm Chase. I noticed in the story about George Washington's teeth, how it seems like you sort of avoided like moral judgment of him in a lot of ways. Like even though the story is about like the teeth that are in his mouth, it didn't seem like you were trying to like paint him one way or another. And I guess like of course the point of the story is that it's about the people the teeth came from. But how did you, or how intentional was it to avoid talking about him that much in the story?
Yeah, it's funny because I actually think that he I actually think the story does judge him in a sense morally, but you're correct in the sense that I want to make the story about the teeth, right? I want to make the story about the people who those teeth belongs to, and so I did purposely always give him this little tidbit at the end, right, where in many ways a tooth has become like a curse to him, or it's harassed him, or it's troubled him in some way, right? And so I think that was certainly intentional. But yeah, I didn't want to make the story about George himself. I figure there's enough stuff about George, right? I want to focus on these teeth they held, and I guess the way I see it, I think that when you read about the story, and most people have ideas that that he himself had these teeth of people he may have owned as property. I think in some ways that's the indictment, right? I think in many ways, sometimes in some ways, perhaps less is more. And I think that the indictment in a sense is there, right? That this person owned other human beings, and here he was using their teeth. And some of those stories were based on, at least two of them were based on stories that come from enslaved people at Mount Vernon, the cook that ran away, as well as the last story of Henrietta was in a sense about certain enslaved people that come from the Washington family. And so, I suppose I could have written a story where it was where Washington himself was more prominently featured. But like I said, I think he gets enough press as it is. I thought getting to the others was better.
Lizzie, do you have a question?
Yeah, I wasn't raising my hand as done, but I could. I guess mine is sort of the more general question of like for people who have never even like dipped their toes in writing sort of in speculative fiction, like do you have any tips for like getting started or even just starting to see things more through that lens?
Oh, pardon me, I couldn't hear the question. Is it in writing or reading?
In writing for yourself.
Oh, for writing speculative fiction? Oh, like, I guess, I'm sorry. Was it advice on like, I guess, for starting writing or so forth?
Yeah, if you've never sort of like dipped your toe in the genre at all,
Right.
Like how you start to perceive things through that sort of imaginative lens.
Yeah. Well, I always say that one of the best things to start is simply to read a lot of it. I mean, that was how I got into it. I didn't get the chance to take an MFA or even a creative writing class, which I would have loved to, but I didn't. I think a lot of mine came from simply reading it. And when I think in reading it, it really helped me develop, I suppose, some sort of understanding of the genre and reading different works. And, that has its good and bad parts. I picked up some good habits. I picked up some bad ones, had to break them from the writers I liked. And so I would suggest one of the first things, again, I think is reading them, joining, if there's any types of like sci-fi literary groups or what have you to discuss these things. It's its own world. There are podcasts, like for Lovecraft Country, there was a podcast for each episode. They had the writers as well as sometimes the actresses, and they really went deep and really discussed it in great detail. So I think what's great is that I think there are a lot of different ways you can immerse yourself into that world. And if you actually want to start writing it, I think, there are even like writers groups that you can find online that you can start. But for me, I always tell people reading is the best. Nothing like reading to jog your own imagination. You're not going to write, don't worry about it. You're not going to write that person's story. No writer wants to do that. You're not going to write that person's story, but something in there might click in your head and say, oh, I've not come up with something that I can do based on my reading here. So I was just reading the genre, if you have an interest in science fiction, there's so many genres and subgenres, everything from steampunk to cloth punk. Find an idea, find one of those subgenres you like and dive in.
Yeah, kind of following on that, I think I found that the short stories in speculative fiction are just these days are just spectacular.
Yeah.
And there's almost a new golden age of just incredible. I can think of a ton of them just offhand that really push the boundaries of storytelling in different ways. It's
and there are graphic novels. There are so many genres. Again, I don't like, some people are like, you're right, you don't watch the TV shows. I don't believe that. Watch the TV. There are some great science fiction series and so forth that are really illuminating. That could really shed some light if you want to. Yeah.
one sort of off the wall question. This is not so much about your writing, but just I'm sure this has that you've seen this. Later in the semester, we're going to be reading something about sort of the more problematic side of science fiction that has, I think on what Liz, that you asked about Lovecraft, that has this other genealogy of racism and sexism and violence. I'm thinking of the Turner Diaries, and that there has been also this absorption among certain communities, white supremacist, white nationalist communities, of certain kinds of science fiction tropes like the Punisher and various things. And I wonder what you just, I'm kind of pressing you to venture out, but what does that make you think to see some of these iconic pop culture things from the speculative world be appropriated by movements that are violent or white supremacist or nationalist?
Yeah. And some people have written, that's a good question. Some people have written some interesting works on that, right? And talked about that, like the Punisher. And I'm glad the actual creator of the Punisher basically disavowed that and so forth. And you know what? I'm not surprised in some of the ways, because when I was younger, I got to know firsthand that a lot of the quote unquote geek spaces was also full of racism, right? The notion that, well, people here are the people that are picked on and they can't possibly harbor these ideas. Oh, let's break you of that right now, right? Some of the worst, I counted some of the worst from those spaces. So I'm not surprised that that out of those things like Gamergate and what have you, that it managed to, anybody who's done online gaming knows about this. Any woman who's done online gaming knows about this, a person of color. And so I'm really not that surprised that they managed to pull in all of these symbologies into this, because, and I mean, especially like one of the things I want to get across in Ring Shout, for instance, if you think of the Klan, it's a bunch of, they're wizards and they're cyclops and they're dragons. This is not new. These notions of pulling on these kinds of things that might sound alluring to a lot of people, right? It's also a recruitment tool, right? You may not, I'm not into the full white supremacy, but I do like the Punisher logo, or I like the Pepe Le Frog thing, or what have you, and it becomes a way to pull people in. Maybe it seems funny at first, and then it continually gets vile as you go down the line. And so I'm not really surprised that they do it. I think it's, now there's this issue at cons and so forth where they show up, but, I think that's just, I don't think that genre is isolated from anything. So it's going to have all those things. And I think just like anything else, just like the classics and medievalists today realize like, white supremacists are using our ideas to promote themselves. We should do something about this. I think that genre has to think about that, right? The creators have to think about how their items are being appropriated and speaking out forcefully and saying, no, we don't represent that. Though I find it kind of humorous that, a bunch of people who grew up, I don't know, watching sci-fi things are now supposed to be tough guy white supremacists. I just don't. It's kind of humorous to me.
Good point. And just as any other questions from y'all? Do you have yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna ask.
Just speak up so you can.
Sorry, I was gonna ask. Like every author kind of has their own brand of magic, and you mentioned some of the places you got it from, and it seems like a very eclectic mix. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the sources for your particular type of magic that you use.
Oh, that's a good question. My magic systems. It depends. I think in Ring Shout, a lot of it is based on really like Gullah folklore. And so there's a lot of that. It's a lot of root type magic, southern root type magic. Then I think of my I don't know what to call it. The world. I wrote a story called "The Dead Djinn in Cairo." It's set in an alternate steampunk Cairo. In that world, that magic is much more attributed to Djinn and other creatures of I suppose myth and folklore, what have you. And so it depends. I think it depends on the story. I think the magic systems always tend to fit the story, though I haven't created the super complex magic system. I haven't done that yet. We're waiting to see if I'll do a book where the magic system is completely defined and only certain people can do this, that, and the third. But I always think the magic system fits the story, right? So that's how I do it.
So last question, can you tell us anything about what you're working on now for the future? And don't feel pressed, but whatever you can tell us.
Now I'm working on my book manuscript for academic world now.
Oh, yeah, that's important. Yeah.
That's the important thing. Speculative fiction wise, it's completed, but Master of Djinn comes out in May. So that's like the full novel that's in the world of A Dead Djinn in Cairo and The Haunting of Tram Card 015. And I am also working on a novella that is a complete secondary fantasy world, which is ironically what I like the most to read. It's interesting that I do steampunk and I did Ring Shout and all these things because my main love is secondary fantasy type world, Dungeons and Dragons type stuff. And so it's a full secondary fantasy world about an assassin who is also dead. So, that kind of thing.
Good. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with us. And if we can clap.
Thank you.
We hope to keep in touch, but thank you so much for spending the time.
Okay, thank you. It's a great class.
Take care.
Guys, stay safe and socially distanced.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.